So what should you do with all of these cultural and political critiques of mainstream psychology that we've considered on this unit? Well, that's what this video is all about. So we've considered how psychology might have become a discipline that's socially and politically unprogressive and is often problematic. So what do you do with that critique? Do you stick with psychology and just become grumpy? Do you leave psychology? Well, there's no reason to leave psychology. We've got a couple of reasonably safe spaces for you. One small, very specialist and not associated with a career outside of academia. The other is still small, but it's growing. It's more generic, and it's associated with a career outside of academia. The first is critical psychology, which is where I am, and the second is community psychology, which is where I used to be. And I'm going to focus on community psychology as it's likely the most useful to most students, as after their degree, most students engage with psychological knowledge and practice outside of academia. I'm going to draw out 6 key features that we find across community psychology as a whole, but bear in mind, there's no common agreement over this, and I'll get to that in a moment. But first, the features. I've put the name and date for the person who's most associated with each feature, so you can go look up each of these features for yourself. So let's start. Number 1, giving psychology away. George Miller, 1969. What this means is sharing our knowledge with those who need it and recognizing that psychological expertise is not only possessed by psychologists. This is about giving our knowledge away, but also giving our status as experts away. And it challenges the way psychology's become a protected, siloed profession, not least shown by the long and circuitous path we've created for those who want to become registered as a psychologist. Number 2. Avoid blaming the victim. William Ryan, 1971. What this means is we stop blaming structural problems on people who suffer the effects of those problems. So we stop individualizing the causes of poor mental health and stop blaming disabled people for their own social exclusion. Number 3, multi-level analysis. Uri Bronfenbrenner, 1979. This is where we understand the complexity of human behavior by moving to multiple levels of analysis, including the individual, group, organizational, societal, cultural, political, and historical. Work that focuses only on one level is reductionist and problematic and pretty much useless. Number 4, prevent rather than treat. George Albee, 1988. This is about pushing for social change to prevent social problems. So poor mental health is a massive social problem, and as George Albee said, no mass disorder afflicting humankind has ever been brought under control by attempts at treating the individual. Number 5, empowerment. Julian Rappaport, 1984. Here's a focus on social power to not only understand how power impacts people's behavior, but how we need to understand power inequality as the cause of most of our most pressing social problems. Final one, number 6, valuing diversity. Ed Trickett, 1993. Here, we need to move beyond binary categories like white versus black, male versus female, straight versus gay, sane versus insane, abled versus disabled, and so on, to recognize and value the full spectrum and glorious spectrum of human diversity. Now, these 6 features of community psychology have the potential to open up some space for us to follow through with the critiques of mainstream psychology that we've developed on this unit. But here's the problem. Not all of the work undertaken in community psychology is socially progressive. So, for example, empowerment can be picked up as an issue around personal empowerment to give people a sense of having more control over their lives, even if nothing is done to change the structural arrangements that causes them to be disempowered in the first place. Prevention can focus on individualized intervention, such as making individuals more resilient. So rather than remove the toxin, you fortify the person so they're more resilient to its ill effects. Kind of like your employer telling you that they won't remove the barrel of radioactive goo sitting in your office, but they will provide you with a hazmat suit to wear, or at least give you instructions on how to make a hazmat suit for yourself. And valuing diversity can be used to leverage open space for already privileged groups to come into the meeting spaces of those who have no privilege under the auspices of, hey, if we're equals, why are you excluding us from your meeting? And all of these things happen because community psychology doesn't have at its core a focus on social power and its abuses. The thing is, not everyone in community psychology is going to be equally aligned to a socially progressive agenda, and this makes the whole task of defining community psychology complicated. It's defined differently depending on who you're talking to and where you are. But there are some broad patterns. So in the US, and to an extent in Australia, it's more focused on the individual. And in countries in Europe, Central America and South America, it's more focused on social systems. But there are also differences within countries, which makes it even harder to map. Community psychology in Australia is an example of this. So in Western Australia, you tend to find more of a focus on cultural issues and issues around social exclusion, more so than in Victoria and New South Wales, where the focus is more on the social and on people's sense of community, for example. And some would say they're more focused on the individual. There's not much official representation of community psychology elsewhere in Australia, so it's not really that clear what other regional flavours there might be. Now, these regional differences reflect both geographical and historical contexts that have arisen in these different regions, but the variations are becoming less distinct because increasingly people migrate into and out of these regions, and as they do so, they take out and bring in different ways of working. And I'm a case in point. So I came to Australia from the UK, and I brought with me a version of community psychology that reflected the work that I did in the UK. This is work I did with someone called David Fryer, and later with a group of community psychologists in Manchester. And it was with the group in Manchester that I co-authored the book Critical Community Psychology, where we defined community psychology as focused on creating social change by creating alliances with people marginalized by social systems. So what I'm saying is that you can find people you can align with in community psychology to help you engage in the types of critical thinking we've been exploring on this unit, but you might not. And that's because that amplified individualism that we've been talking about all through this unit affects everyone in psychology in different ways, and that's as true for community psychology as any other area of psychology, though community psychology has the promise of a few more escape hatches from those mainstream individualized ways of working. If you want a space that's more fully detached from that individualized approach, then you need to head into critical psychology. That's where I am now. It's also known as critical social psychology. It's the space that we've been occupying on this unit. But critical psychology and critical social psychology only really exist in academia. As outside of academia, it's not really a thing, or at least it transforms into a different sort of thing, like political activism. And that means critical psychology seems a bit detached, or at least unrecognized by the world outside of the academy. And it's difficult to map a career path in critical psychology outside of the academy. So it's good if you plan to be an academic for the rest of your life, but if you're not planning that, then not so good. So that's one of the reasons why some of us moved into an area called critical community psychology, which sort of sits in between the academic world and the world outside of academia. But I'm not going to talk about that just now. I've got another video on that on my YouTube channel. And if I got into that just now, we'd never finish this unit. And I do need to wrap things up for this unit, and I'm going to do that in my next video, which will sum up what we've been doing, what we've been talking about, and yeah, so till then, ta-da.